Well, welcome everyone to this panel discussion about student activism at Emory. Really excited to get this going, so let's just get right into it. If I can turn the slides. Let's try that. There we go. All right, so we'd like to just start with some brief introductions. My name is Koan Roy-Meighoo. I'm a first-year undergraduate student at Emory University. I recently graduated from Decatur High School, about 20 minutes away, this spring. So I've been involved in Atlanta social justice advocacy and organizations for a while now. I'm here today to represent the Beacon Hill Black Alliance as well as Emory students. The Beacon Hill Black Alliance is an organization based in Decatur, in the historic Beacon Hill community, which was a thriving African-American community that has recently been very affected by gentrification, but the organization itself is a kind of grassroots activism group committed to combating the effects of colonialism and uplifting marginalized communities, as I said, through grassroots activism, which we can kind of talk about what that means a bit later. Klamath?
Hi, everyone. I don't really know where I'm at, if I'm on the screen or on Zoom. This whole thing is really awesome. But I'm actually presenting from Oregon, so it's 1 o'clock my time. My name is Henry. I graduated from Emory College in 2019. I went to graduate school. I'm just working on finishing my thesis right now, but I'm from the Shasta tribe of California and the Tuscarora Nation of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy. And a lot of the work that I did at Emory and that I'm doing in a sort of different fashion now has to do about Native American student recruitment, retention, and sovereignty.
So we thought we'd start with just a few broad questions about the importance of student activism in our community. And so our first question is, how would you define student activism? Klamath, if you want to start. Yeah.
Okay. Personally, when I was a student, I could say that student activism, there is no one broad umbrella definition. I think it just has to do, especially for me, it was where my interest and frustration lied, and then sort of what I did actively to sort of settle my frustrations and alleviate some of the issues that I found within my own community at Emory. Like I said, I think it's individualized. Students can become activists in whatever it is that they're passionate about or where they're finding their own frustrations. And so it doesn't have one specific definition. I think it looks many different ways. I was a part of the athlete community for a while while I was at Emory. I'm now a coach, and I'm finding that mentoring students, especially at the community college level, student activism there at a 2-year school looks a lot different than it does at a 4-year institution like Emory. So I like to keep a pretty open umbrella term for that specific definition.
To me, I think student activism is really any action that includes and centers youth perspectives. So that means that you don't have to be a student to be part of student activism. It only requires that you let young people, their ideas and experiences kind of lead in a conversation. So for all the non-students at this panel or at this event, it means just like in the work that you do, including youth perspectives. But for students, student activism isn't just any action that you do though. Kind of in the age of social media, I think there's a lot of information sharing that is kind of branded as activism that, if not done in the right way, can be problematic. So, what student activism looks like really for me is connecting yourself to a, broader community than, your small circle, and also using your power and influence as a young person to platform others as well. So in the classroom, that looks like finding different forms of sources and authoritative, evidence. It looks like in the broader community, connecting yourself to other organizations that are, doing work. And so that in no way means that like student activism is independent of or, kind of is ignorant of past movements. It's very much about learning and involving past leaders But student activism is just kind of a way of reversing a typical hierarchy in which the student just follows and never leads. And so as a concept, it begins to kind of shape and question, you know, the educational system and the role of students in our community. And so the next question is, why is student activism necessary on college campuses?
For me personally, I think if student activists didn't exist, nothing would get done. Just in my own experience, I feel like a lot of the initiatives and positive change that has happened, especially at Emory, but also the other institutions that I've been a part of, have always been because of student activists. I've never, there's of course, and I think, wait, how do I want to phrase this? It's like, I really like, Koan, what you had mentioned about in your classroom or where it can happen everywhere. I've found, especially with some of my mentors who are educators, being an activist in the classroom and really being present, having that collaboration inside of the classroom also makes change happen. It is necessary, because if we didn't have student activists, we just wouldn't have change at all. It's absolutely necessary. I don't know how else to put it besides it is necessary, because it is. I just don't think any other change would happen without it.
Right, I kind of agree. There's a pretty straightforward answer to this question where it just, you know, it just is necessary, but kind of on a surface level, it is necessary because we are in an institution that is kind of historically exclusive and oppressive. You know, the university institution in the United States has that history. And so student activism takes the perspectives of those who are kind of most influenced by a school's environment and works to counteract this history of oppression. But kind of on a larger scale, thinking about college as an institution as a starting point for many other larger social movements, you know, universities have incredible influences on their surrounding community. For example, if a curricular change is made at the university level, we're likely to see versions of that change at the secondary education level and even the primary education level. So, you know, student activism on college campuses can define what is talked about in the larger community. If we change our university, we can also change what the university broadcasts to a greater area. So moving to the next slide, kind of some key questions for student activists in relation specifically to in wake of the slavery and dispossession and kind of decolonial activism. What do we consider to be everyday implications and effects of slavery and dispossession?
I like to just speak for my own self and for my own perspective. And so, especially as a former student at Emory and as someone who was a part at that time of a very small student population, there were only a handful of Native students at Emory when I had attended, and that was only like 2 years ago. I think that sort of the culture that is associated with the South of very, very just oppressive behaviors, whether that be slavery or dispossession of land or dispossession of property. I think that the everyday implications of that for me and myself was not having Native students and them not feeling welcome on the campus. And truthfully, that was because Emory at that moment in time wasn't really being sold as being a Native, like pro-Native place. Recently, I noticed that the university had come out with a land acknowledgement, which means a lot to Native people, seeing that there's an active relationship and some sort of reparations that are trying to be made for really tragic events that have occurred. But I think the everyday implications of just not seeing people like yourself in the classroom. I had experienced a lot of microaggressions, all of it just with the idea that the status quo of being inside of a colonial system was okay. And I don't think that unless you, like for me personally in that position, I was very aware of there not being a lot of Native students on campus, but for others, it never really was a question. Like, people weren't questioning why there weren't any Native students in question. I think the everyday implications and effects of all of that is just erasure unless you're actively looking for it. But every day, just so there was so much. for me personally. And there's more that could be touched on, but like I said, I only really like to speak for myself.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think a lot of the ways that I think about how kind of slavery and dispossession and their legacies manifest themselves in almost every facet of our society is about these things that it's about what we look for, and it's about affecting who we see and, you know, who's represented. I think as well, just in any large issue that we're talking about, the influence of colonialism is present. So in the environmental crisis, which is a, you know, huge hot topic on Emory campus as well, there's often a refusal to incorporate indigenous knowledge about land and agricultural practice into our environmental practices. There's also kind of this capitalist interest further exploiting land and African-American workers that does not take into account, it treats the environment as separate from a legacy of colonialism. In education, you know, we see the Georgia State School Board right now, like clearly still practicing a form of erasure, the same form of erasure of dispossession and genocide, but, you know, now just in our education system where we're not even going to be able to talk about these things soon. I also think, like Klamath was saying, there are epistemic implications of kind of like framing how we even see some issues. So, you know, even the idea of dispossession, when Klamath and I were talking about earlier, you know, before this discussion, she brought up this really interesting point about, in order for land to be dispossessed, it had to be turned into property in the first place, which is against kind of, or which is not reflected in many indigenous cultures or knowledge systems. So, you know, by framing this discussion about dispossession, we're also still imposing a kind of colonial view of the issue. So, which leads us to who's responsible for combating the legacy of colonialism?
Everybody. But it's in different layers. So the people who have the most power. So in a university setting, that would be the president of the university, people who are in director, dean type positions, people who hold a lot of power. Like right now, I work in an athletic department. For me, it's the athletic director and then the dean of students. In a university setting, it's the people who are in positions of power. But aside from that, it's especially the white people in positions of power. And then like you can keep tearing down where it's straight white people in positions of power. And then even further than that, they're white straight men who are in positions of power. Like I personally see it as this ladder for the responsibility. But also I personally take a lot of responsibility for combating the legacy of colonialism, because personally I want to make, and I know this seems really corny, but I want to make the world a better place, and for everyone. I, in my own personal belief system, believe that everything that I'm doing in the present day has to be for 7 generations down the road. And so I take that responsibility. I really feel strongly about that responsibility, just because I see how colonialism has affected those who were 7 generations in front of me, and I want to make sure that everything I'm doing in the present moment is making sure that those things aren't relived, and that the tragedies that are happening in the present day don't continue on. So 7 generations down the road, maybe potentially we could have healing. But if you're unsure about your responsibilities, I've found that it's oftentimes okay to ask. I had a lot of administrators while I was at Emory just blatantly ask me, like, what can I do? What can I do? Like, where do I fit in this? What can I do? And I think oftentimes that those were the most productive conversations that I had as a student activist, was people just being honest, like, I'm at a loss, what can I do? And I found a lot of healing and a lot of productivity in those spaces. But like I said, the burden's on everyone, but I see oftentimes where the burden's especially placed on the people who are feeling the impacts of colonialism the most, which is not how it should be. But definitely, if you have questions about it, it's totally okay when issues arise to ask just a simple question, what can I do? And keep that mindset that it's not just about the present moment when we're working on these things. Colonialism, if it takes however many hundreds of years for us to get to this point, it's going to take us that many 100 years to heal. But knowing that you're a part of that process makes it worthwhile.
I mean, I completely agree. I think kind of in the age of allyship and thinking about bringing more voices to the table and sometimes stepping back from center stage, I think everybody is responsible to, in contributing to the fight. There are different ways that, depending on who you are, what position you're in, that looks. And so I think in a university, as students, it's our job to push professors and the institution about, what questions are you asking, what issues are you dealing with? And I think it's the university's job as a general, the student body and everybody involved to kind of ask the larger community of, what do you need from us? And so I think it is certainly Emory's role to reach out, as it is doing right now in organizing this symposium, reaching out to the larger community and asking, what they need. And so this last question, what does the intersection of slavery and dispossession tell us about how to approach decolonial activism?
I found oftentimes in the classroom, a lot of my frustration in some of the classes that were trying to approach decolonial, and I'm talking like 2015. Obviously, the field has, and studies into these types of topics has greatly progressed. But I was very frustrated that like we were always telling kind of like part two, which is slavery, without telling part one, which was dispossession and moving of people, of Native peoples off the land. And so my thing is that the two things, we can't have the complete story of how we got to where we're at today if we don't tell all of the stories. When we're approaching decolonial activism, I really don't like using the word decolonialism anymore because I find it on a personal level, working for a sovereign nation, I don't like to think that we are colonized, that we have been resilient and have been resistant towards colonialism. I do think that, like I said, though, you can't have one without the other. And oftentimes, like I have found, we're telling one story without the other. There are definitely times and places to highlight one story, but in order to have a full understanding of where we're at right now, like the land acknowledgement, we need to acknowledge the people who built the university after people were removed. Or if we talk about how the university came to be and the people who were forced to build the university, then we need to talk about how we acquired the land. Like all of that makes up the total story of where we're at today and where our feet are. And so my own approach, I would say, to all of this is just being really understanding of all of the stories that encompass the total picture and being willing to listen when I don't know, like when I just don't know how people are feeling about particular topics. But I think definitely there's been a big push within, since I became a freshman, Koan, you're a freshman now, since I was in your shoes till now, I'm just so happy that we're talking about this intersection because as a freshman, it wasn't really something that was being tackled as actively as it is now.
Yeah, I think this kind of interconnectedness, these intertwined histories are inseparable. And I think the way that, at least in Georgia education, as they're often thought of as two separate movements, and especially events of the past, as that slavery and dispossession are things of the past that happen separately, that kind of were dark sides of a history for a greater good. And I think that we have to start questioning not only the intent of colonialism, but also how we portray these different historical events and movements. I think the interconnectedness of slavery and dispossession also tells us that how we move forward also has to be considering this interconnectedness. I think it means that whenever we kind of act for the interests of the African American community or the indigenous community, we have to include the other. Yeah. So now we're going to kind of get into what we do specifically in our work and organizing, and kind of the core ideologies behind that, and kind of how we how all these ideas and ideologies manifest themselves in daily practice. So to start, I kind of want to go over how I approach all my work in the community. And so there are kind of, when I was thinking about it, there were kind of three main ideas that I hold really dear whenever I'm doing any work in the community. So the first one is kind of what we were talking about already, interconnectedness and intersectionality. So I'm always reminding myself that all struggles are connected, that, you know, we cannot act for one community without thinking about the other. And that in this idea that in fighting white supremacy and colonialism, we are also fighting a patriarchal and heteronormative episteme, that we're also we're thinking about not just history, but the sciences, that all of our subjects that we usually consider separate and distinct from each other are very much connected. The next kind of tenet of my ideologies are grassroots activism, which I think is connected in many ways to kind of intellectual movements around the rhizome. But I think that, you know, grassroots activism means organizing and acting without conventions of organization. You know, there's no hierarchical structure to grassroots activism. There's no centralized or, you know, figure to lead a movement. It's instead about lateral relations and lateral storytelling. It's about bringing every voice to the table without that search for a representative central figure, and valuing every perspective, and realizing that this combination and relation of perspectives is a better way of understanding history than what we usually have, where one perspective is dogma. You know, instead we have to treat history as variable and subjective. And that kind of connects to this last point of a lot of my work is about the power of creativity. So understanding that arts and creative arts, they're a universal language. They're a great way to talk to many, many different, a multi-generational and multicultural audience for educating and organizing. This means promoting types of art that are typically not considered as art, or from artists who are typically ignored. It also means re-examining, you know, our normative gaze and questioning typical, you know, conventions of creativity and art. And kind of going back to the subjectivity of history, you know, thinking about history itself as an art form and as a narrative, meaning that we can find history in what we usually deem creative or artistic forms, such as storytelling, narrative, and more. And so what that looks like in practice is kind of, I've broken my work up into three areas: monument and artifact removal first. So, you know, given the fact that art has power, monuments symbolize what we value as a community, and they also affect how we view history. So right here in Atlanta and Decatur, there were two Confederate monuments: the Lost Cause Monument, erected in 1908 after the Atlanta race riots by the Daughters of the Confederacy, and what has now become known as the Genocide Cannon, which was used in the 1836 Indian Wars, also erected by the Daughters of the Confederacy. And so in removing these, we've held teach-ins, protests, student events, and, you know, we've presented to the city and county commission to kind of advocate for their removal, or at the very least recontextualization. On the eve of Juneteenth in 2020, we were able to remove the Lost Cause obelisk. You'll see a picture of that on the screen. We're still working to remove the genocide cannon. And I think that's really interesting, because going back to the connection of African and Indigenous history, struggles, and futures, you know, we always say that when the county finally agreed to take down the Lost Cause Monument, they should have gone ahead and taken that cannon too. But because they don't recognize the connected struggle, they didn't see those artifacts and their history as tied. So going to the next thing, public art initiatives. We don't just remove, we also have to replace, but we go beyond replacing. You know, we're not simply changing a monument, which would still kind of enforce this idea of monumentalization as a method for asserting power and authority. But, you know, we have this project called the Art for the People Project, which is about educational, interactive community artwork. So we created, you'll see in the top right of this slide, this statue called What Sonia Said by artist Alex Swavoni, which is, we raised over $40,000 to get it built. It's in the Ebster Recreational Center, which is in Decatur, Georgia. And we've kind of created a space around which to organize. So this artwork is about the connection of African and Indigenous histories, and works to highlight kind of their successes and brilliance and not just their oppression. So it's a space where educators can gather or organizers to hold larger community events to teach about other initiatives. And kind of the last sphere of my work is in curriculum reform. So, you know, the teach-ins that I talked about before about the monuments are kind of done to correct the failures of our current education system. So we're also trying to directly change that so that we don't have to retroactively try to correct what students are learning. So I'm in the process of developing something called the JADE program, which is a direct investment into the environment of the Decatur school system and can hopefully be expanded across the South. But it's a 3-year middle school program that kind of has 3 functions. It fills in curricular gaps that the state currently has in its curriculum. It's also about a civic education, which informs students how to get involved in their communities. And it also provides students with the tools they need to kind of have an ideological foundation for the activist work they want to do. So that's kind of where, you know, where I work. So Klamath, if you want to talk about your work now.
I was told that I need to speak louder, so I'm going to try to talk louder so everyone can hear me. I'm not sure how well my camera and speaker situation is going, but so specifically with Native student recruitment and retention, what does it mean and what are the ethics of recruitment and retention? And that's something that I really started to focus on, I think, my last year at Emory is what are the ethics of bringing a group of students who haven't historically been at this university into the university? Why are we bringing these students into the university? Is it because of guilt or is it because of something else? I think ethically, if we're to recruit Native students to a university, we need to have all the structures in place in order to keep them at the university, to help them be and remain connected with their communities that they come from, to have space to be able to practice their traditional culture, to just exist and feel safe. And I think that we're on the correct trajectory right now. I'm not at Emory every day, so I couldn't exactly tell you I'm not there anymore like I was a few years ago. But specifically with Native student recruitment and retention, and this expands to everyone, are just what are the ethics of recruiting these students, giving them promises of a 4-year education with a degree. What does that actually look like for those students? And how does the university have a responsibility for providing services to those students to keep them in the university and feel safe? And so that's really what I was focused on while I was at Emory. The group that's currently working with Native student recruitment and retention are doing an absolutely fantastic job. Kudos to all of them for continuing the fight, and it's really amazing to see how far the group and all of their work has gone. Specifically now, I work on relationality and respect for sovereignty. I work as a research librarian, so I work for the Confederated Tribes of Grand Ronde, Community of Oregon, and within their cultural resource center / museum, and I provide support to people who work in historic preservation work, who work outwardly with different state, federal partners, community partners, on just really maintaining sovereignty through culture. And so now, like as an undergrad, that was something that I studied a lot and I was very interested in. Thought a lot about anthropology, how it's been extractive and how it can have really positive influences within communities. I've seen both sides of it, and really thought about the theory of all of those things. And then now, as an adult, I guess, with a big girl job and no longer a student, I'm actually doing it in practice and really trying to help be a part of the machine that is furthering the sovereignty of this tribal nation. And I'm very grateful for all the opportunities I've been given here to sort of take all of those dreams that I had as a student, learning from my professors, and turn them into a reality for a nation of people. I think it's really super awesome that I'm in the position that I am. But I wouldn't necessarily consider it activism as much as it is just being a part of a community that's trying to maintain and strengthen their sovereignty.
Oh, there we go. So we're kind of going to zoom out now and kind of talk about broader ideas. The title of our panel discussion, or the subtitle, was Decolonizing in Practice, Resistance, Repossession, and Restorative Justice. And so we're just going to kind of talk about those terms. And so what does repossession and restorative justice mean to you?
Kind of what you mentioned earlier, Colin, which I completely forgot that I had said. I have a lot going on in my life right now, and sometimes I ramble, but it was a really good point that I made a few weeks ago about possession. A lot of tribes don't ever consider themselves inside of their own communities as having possessed the land. They were a part of the land, and trees and rocks and the sky and everything had being. And so this idea of possession is very colonial in construct, but it's something that we're sort of operating within now. So I'm okay with the term. But to repossess for me means that at some point someone else took that thing away from you. And so you're going to take it back. Hence movements like the land back movement, repossess something. And restorative justice, to me, in my everyday work, here at the Confederated in Ronde, the tribe was terminated and worked very hard to restore the tribe with the federal government and have that process go through. And today, we're actually approaching the celebration of restoration. And so when I think of restorative justice, I think of all of the benefits that the tribal members here experience because of restoration, and a lot of the healing that goes on within this community actively on a day-to-day basis. I see it. People healing, the land healing, the air, the sky, the water. There's just so much healing that's happening because of restoration. And I think it's a very powerful word, restoration or restorative justice. I think having that idea of healing and relationality and connectivity, I think all of those things are very important. And so to me, that's what restorative justice really means, is healing, bringing healing to something that has caused a lot of pain and trauma for a lot of people. So yeah, and thanks for reminding me that I said that, Koan, because that was a really good point. I'm appreciative.
Yeah, I think similar to Klamath, I don't necessarily think of repossession as just something physical or, you know, just about the land itself, but I think that when we think about how to work towards repossession, it means giving platforms back to certain people, giving spaces back to people, like ideological spaces as well, and rethinking how we go about our everyday lives in kind of this colonial society, and working backwards to like reconsider how we got here. And so I think that kind of leads to restorative justice as not necessarily a reversion to a previous state, but instead a way of creating balance and equity between communities. I think it's ideas of shifting justice, you know, our very notions of justice, which have for a long time been corrupted and used as tools of oppression. I think it also means getting everyone involved in the fight for justice, not just those who are most affected. So yeah, it's not just this thing about taking back what was taken if it wasn't considered to be gone in the first place. It's more about moving ahead. And so that leads us to kind of how can you as an Emory community member get involved? I've thrown up a lot of QR codes here. I urge you to take your phone up and kind of scan them. This is just specifically for the Beacon Hill Black Alliance, but there are many other great organizations that I really encourage you to look into in that area. Asian Americans Advancing Justice, Swing Left, all these great organizations. And so there are a few things up on this board that I'm just kind of gonna, skip past because we have 10 minutes remaining, but I encourage you to check them out. We have webinars, public events, protests, all these kind of different things happening. So I can stay on this slide just for a little bit for everybody to scan it in the room, I know. But let's move to Q&A now. If anybody has any questions, in person or virtual, feel free to send them.
I think there was a question in the chat that I can answer. That was from Dr. S. I can't see if there's any people in the room walking up. I don't know. I'm trying my best here virtually, so if anyone has a question, I'm interrupting you. I apologize.
Yes, so Klamath, we got someone to kind of like field the virtual and in-person questions. So yeah.
Perfect.
Right, so we got a question on the Q&A. What advice do you have for current Indigenous students and other students at Emory?
Okay, now I understand the system. I apologize. So number one, to stay strong, but know that you don't have to be strong all the time, and that it's okay to ask for help, and that there's many people in the community who can help you and are willing to help you. But it sometimes, I know for myself, I'm very anti asking for help, and so once I learned how to do that, I started to really thrive. I think specifically for Indigenous students, it's also understanding that Atlanta is a very complicated place, and that sometimes it's okay to just feel heavy. There's a lot of tragedy that happened and is happening in the city of Atlanta, and I think Indigenous people, not to overgeneralize, but a lot of my friends and people who I speak with about frequently about this is that we feel things and we feel them very heavily as they're happening. So it's okay to take days for yourself. It's okay to create distance between things that are making you feel kind of down or not okay, but also equally as much so, it's okay to voice your opinions when you're frustrated by those kinds of things and know that you have worth and that you are important and that generations of Indigenous people have sacrificed a lot for you to be here. And so staying strong and all of that and being proud of yourself and your community, I think, are some of the biggest pieces of advice that I have.
So this is just a question that I have for you, Klamath. I'm a librarian, and I saw you said you're a librarian, and I really am interested into knowing, like, how did you want to take this path to do your activism, to use this as a point of like a voice? I'm just really curious to know how you got into it.
Truthfully, I didn't really know what the job was when I applied, but I was like, wow, this is cool. I get to work at a cultural resource center with books and archives and stuff. I do a lot with belongings that are repatriated, everything. So I'm lucky in that regard. But I really kind of learned that like metadata language that you use to describe books, especially with Indigenous people, terrible. The metadata is awful and it's widespread and it's in the Library of Congress and it's everywhere. The language that we use to be really oppressive, I've found a lot of interest in as I've started this job and began looking at how we're coding things and how we talk about particular subjects. Because a lot of the literature written about Indigenous people, it's very bad. It's either incorrect or it's harmful or it's just not, it's boring. And so how do you take things like that and sort of frame them so people can get a better and more clearer picture of what history is? And you can do that as a librarian through how you code your books and how you sort of assist people in their research and guide them towards particular destinations. But I found great joy just in labeling and using different types of non-traditional coding systems that incorporate like native plants for the area, for ethnobotany books, or having different typography for like books about archaeology. I think, I don't know, I've just found like quirky little ways to sort of indigenize being a librarian, and I think the language that we use to speak about materials is very important. I don't know if that answers your question or not, but.
So we have a Q&A question. This has been a very rich panel. Thank you. I would love for Emory to create structures where students partner with faculty to design courses that have an applied component of activism and engagement as part of the course, co-teaching, co-leading opportunities, which have impactful products produced within the course. I think it's more of a comment.
I think, Koan, you would be great at doing something like that. That'd be a great opportunity for you. I do have to say to everyone attending this particular session that my fellow panelist, he has done a really brilliant job at sort of contributing to this and leading it. And I'm very happy and satisfied with the fact that this is the future of Emory University and someone who's going to really make an impact with the university for years to come. So it's nice because as an alum, I'm like, yes, the university is in safe hands as I talk to more students who are there at the university now. So I just want to say kudos to you for really doing a great job, and you're a very impressive younger than me. I'm a young person, but younger than me person.
Well, thank you for the praise and for that comment about kind of including community organizations in Emory classes. I think that is happening already in certain classes. I think there are some amazing professors here who are not only involved in the community themselves, but very much aware of what's happening. And so they are bringing in organizations like Beacon Hill. I also think the affinity spaces in the Office for DEI, they're doing great work with community outreach at Emory already. And I think the organizers of this symposium are doing a great job to reach out to organizations like Beacon Hill and Fair Fight and all of them to include in this panel. But yeah, I entirely agree. Some kind of very much ingrained in like the outside of Emory community element to many classes would be a great way to introduce students on like how to be activists, but also let students share their perspectives to their professors and to these organizations. Yeah. I think if we don't have any more questions, we're just about finished on time too. So thank you all for attending this. It's been a pleasure to speak to you all. Yeah, thank you.
I have one more thing to say to everyone who's attending before we close. Please do due diligence to look at what is happening in Canada with the boarding and / residential schools today. There's a huge recognition for that. So look it up, become more informed on that, because today a lot of people are mourning and trying to heal. So thank you.